The wind hit Mira so hard she nearly fell to her knees. Snow whipped across her face like tiny blades, and her paws had gone numb hours ago. She had been walking since dawn, and now the sky had turned the color of ash, and the storm that had been threatening all day finally broke loose. Somewhere behind her, far behind her now, was the only home she had ever known, and it no longer wanted her. She had left with nothing. No pack mark, no claim to territory, no one to walk beside her. The elders had stripped her of her place in a single meeting, their faces cold as the wind that now tore at her fur. She had tried to speak, tried to explain that she had not stolen the herd's stores, that she had not betrayed anyone, but her voice had been swallowed by the accusations thrown at her by a wolf who smiled while he lied. Ethan had always resented her quiet confidence, the way she moved through the pack without needing to raise her voice to be noticed. When the chance came to remove her, he had taken it without hesitation, and the alpha, tired and distracted by other troubles, had not looked closely enough to see the truth. Now Mira walked through unfamiliar land, her breath turning to frost the moment it left her mouth. She did not know where she was going. She only knew she could not stop, because stopping in this cold meant she might never start again. The trees here were taller than the ones she had grown up around, their branches heavy with snow, bending low as if the forest itself was tired. She pushed forward, her legs shaking, her mind drifting to memories she wished she could unsee. The betrayal on Chloe's face when she chose to stay silent rather than defend her closest friend. The murmurs of wolves she had once shared meals with, looking away as she was marched to the border. The way the pack had closed ranks behind her, as if she had never belonged there at all. She stumbled over a fallen branch hidden beneath the snow, and caught herself against a tree trunk, her side scraping against the rough bark. Pain flared through her ribs, old bruises from the journey deepening with every hour she stayed on her feet. She pressed a paw against her side and kept moving, because the alternative was to lie down in the snow and let the cold finish what her pack had started. The blizzard grew worse as the afternoon wore into evening. Visibility shrank to almost nothing. Mira could no longer tell if she was walking in a straight line or circling back on her own trail. Every direction looked the same, a wall of white, broken only by dark shapes of trees that appeared and disappeared like ghosts. She called out once, a weak sound lost instantly to the wind. Though she did not know who she expected to answer, there was no one left who claimed her. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. Time had become slippery and strange. Her thoughts grew foggy, the cold seeping past her fur and into her bones. She thought of her mother, gone many seasons now, and wondered if this was how it felt at the very end, this strange calm settling over the panic. She thought of the den she grew up in, warm and full of noise, and how far away that memory now felt, like something that had happened to a different wolf entirely. She did not notice when the ground began to slope downward. She did not notice the scent of unfamiliar wolves growing stronger in the air, carried toward her on the wind. Her senses had dulled to almost nothing, narrowed down to the single task of putting one paw in front of the other. She was crossing into land that did not belong to her, land marked by a pack she had never heard of, though in her exhaustion she could not have cared less whose ground she stood on. She only needed to keep moving, or she needed to stop, and she was no longer certain which was more dangerous. The wind howled through a narrow ravine, and Mira followed it without meaning to, drawn by some instinct she could not name. The trees thickened here, offering a little relief from the worst of the storm, and for a moment she thought she might catch her breath. She pressed herself against a boulder half buried in drifted snow, trying to shield herself from the wind, and for the first time in hours, she allowed herself to close her eyes, just for a second, just long enough to steady her breathing. That second stretched longer than she intended. When her legs finally gave out beneath her, she did not fight it. She sank into the snow, her body curling instinctively for warmth that would not come. Her last clear thought before the cold pulled her under was not of anger toward the pack that cast her out, nor fear of what waited in this unfamiliar territory. It was simply a quiet, aching wish that somewhere, someone might still believe her. The snow began to settle over her still form, softly at first, then thicker, until the shape of her blended almost seamlessly into the white world around her. The wind carried her scent onward, deeper into the ravine, toward territory patrolled by wolves who had no reason to expect a stranger, let alone one so close to the edge of everything. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a young scout moved along his usual route, checking the borders before the worst of the storm made travel impossible. He was not looking for anything unusual. He was thinking about getting back to the den before the wind grew any stronger, about the warm fire waiting for him, about nothing more complicated than finishing his patrol. But scent carries strangely in a storm, twisting and doubling back on itself, and something in the air made him slow his pace. He told himself it was nothing, a trick of the wind, but his instincts told him otherwise. He turned from his usual path and followed the strange thread of scent down into the ravine, his curiosity outweighing his caution. He almost missed her entirely. She was little more than a mound in the snow, easy to overlook in the fading light, easy to mistake for a drift shaped by the wind. But something about the shape caught his eye, an unnatural curve, a stillness that did not belong to nature. He approached carefully, his ears alert, his senses sharpening as he closed the distance. When he saw her clearly, his breath caught. A wolf lay half buried in the snow, her fur dusted white, her body unnervingly still. He could see the shallow rise and fall of her chest, faint but present, proof that whoever she was still alive, though barely. He had never seen her before. She did not carry the scent of his pack, nor any pack he recognized. She was a stranger, alone in territory that did not belong to her, in a storm that had already claimed lesser creatures. He knew the rules. Strangers were to be reported, not touched, especially strangers found deep within packland during a storm this dangerous. But something about her stillness unsettled him in a way rules could not override. She looked so small against the snow, so utterly without protection, that leaving her here felt less like following protocol and more like abandoning her to a fate she had not chosen. He hesitated only a moment longer before making his decision. He turned and ran, his paws tearing through the deep snow, back toward the den, back toward wolves who could help him decide what to do next. Behind him, the storm continued to rage, and the stranger in the snow remained where she had fallen, unaware that her fate was about to change in ways she could never have predicted. The scout's name was Owen, and he had never in his life run so fast toward home. His mind raced even faster than his legs, turning over what he had just seen, wondering how he would explain finding a stranger so deep within their land. He knew some of the older wolves would want her removed immediately, sent back across the border, regardless of the storm, regardless of whether she survived the journey. He knew others might see her as a threat, an unknown scent carrying unknown danger, but he also knew that no matter what anyone decided, someone needed to know she was there before the snow buried her for good. He burst into the clearing where the den entrance sat nestled between two large rock formations, snow already piling against the entrance despite the wolves' best efforts to keep it clear. Several wolves looked up as he approached, sensing his urgency before he even opened his mouth to speak. He explained quickly, breathlessly, the words tumbling out faster than he intended. A stranger, alone, collapsed in the ravine near the old fallen pine, not moving much, might not last the night if left where she was. The reactions were immediate and mixed, exactly as he expected. One of the older wolves, a broad-shouldered male named Victor, immediately voiced doubt, arguing that strangers who wandered onto packland uninvited were rarely there by accident, and that the storm was reason enough to leave well enough alone, rather than risk exposing the den to unknown danger. A female named Ivy disagreed just as quickly, her voice sharp with disbelief that anyone would suggest leaving a wolf to die in weather this severe, regardless of where she came from or why she was there. Owen stood in the middle of the growing argument, his fur still dusted with snow, his breathing finally slowing, as the warmth of the den began to seep into him. He had not expected his discovery to cause such immediate division, though looking back, perhaps he should have. Strangers were rarely simple matters among wolves, who valued their territory and their safety above almost everything else. It was Elena, calm and steady as always, who finally spoke the words that shifted the conversation. She reminded the gathered wolves that whatever their opinions on strangers, whatever their fears about unknown scents and unknown pasts, none of that mattered if the stranger in question was already dying. There would be time enough to ask questions once she was safe. There would be no questions to ask at all if they waited too long deciding what to do. Her words settled over the group, and even Victor, still visibly unconvinced, did not argue further. All eyes turned toward the den's entrance, where their alpha had just appeared, drawn by the commotion, his expression unreadable as he took in the scene before him. Cade listened without interrupting as Owen repeated his account, his sharp eyes moving between the scout and the rest of his pack as the story unfolded. He asked few questions, mostly about her condition, how far she was, how deep the snow had gotten around her. When Owen finished speaking, a heavy silence settled over the den, everyone waiting to hear what their alpha would decide. Cade did not take long to answer. He had built his leadership on decisiveness, on trusting his instincts, even when the easier choice might have been to hesitate. And though he understood the concerns being raised around him, though he recognized the risk of bringing an unknown wolf into his territory during the most vulnerable hours of the year, he also understood something else, something that mattered more in this particular moment. No wolf under his protection would ever be asked to walk past another creature dying in the snow, regardless of where that creature came from. He gave the order simply, without theatrics. Bring her in. Keep her warm. Ask questions later, once she could actually answer them. Owen did not wait to be told twice. He turned and ran back out into the storm, 2 other wolves falling into step beside him, their paws once again tearing through the deepening snow as they retraced his path toward the ravine. The wind had not softened at all in his absence. If anything, it seemed to have grown angrier, hurling snow sideways with a force that made even experienced wolves squint against the assault. They found her exactly where Owen had left her, the shape of her body now almost completely reclaimed by the drifting snow. For one terrible moment, Owen feared they were too late, that the stillness he had noted earlier had deepened into something permanent. But as they cleared the snow away from her, he caught the faintest movement of her chest again, shallow but unmistakable, and something in him eased slightly, though the urgency of their task had not lessened at all. Between the 3 of them, they managed to lift her carefully, mindful of her thin frame, mindful of the way her body seemed to fold in on itself from cold and exhaustion. She did not stir as they moved her, did not react at all to the shift from stillness to motion, and that unresponsiveness worried Owen more than anything else about her condition. The journey back to the den felt longer than the journey out, though it likely took no more time at all. Every step through the snow felt weighted with consequence, every gust of wind a reminder of how little time they might have left before her body simply stopped fighting. Owen kept glancing at her as they moved, watching for any sign, any flicker of awareness, and finding none. When they finally reached the den, the warmth inside felt almost shocking after the brutal cold of the ravine. Wolves parted to let them through, murmurs rising as they caught sight of the stranger's condition, her fur matted with ice, her body limp in a way that spoke clearly of how close she had come to not surviving at all. Grace, the pack's healer, was already moving before they had fully entered, her sharp eyes assessing Mira with the practiced efficiency of someone who had tended to countless injuries and ailments over many seasons. She directed the wolves carrying Mira toward the warmest corner of the den, instructing them to lay her near the fire, but not too close, to avoid warming her too quickly after such prolonged exposure to the cold. The next several minutes passed in a blur of quiet, focused activity. Grace checked Mira's breathing, her heartbeat, the color beneath her fur where the skin was visible. She noted the bruising along her ribs, older injuries layered beneath the newer damage caused by the storm and the long journey that had led her here. Whatever had happened to this wolf before she ever reached Frostback territory, it was clear her suffering had not begun with the blizzard. Cade watched from a short distance, his expression carefully neutral, though his eyes lingered on the stranger longer than strictly necessary. There was something about her, something in the exhaustion etched into every line of her small frame, that struck him as different from the threat Victor had feared. She did not look like a wolf sent to scout or spy. She looked like a wolf who had been running from something far worse than the storm, and had simply run out of places left to go. He said nothing of this thought aloud, not yet. There would be time for questions once she woke, once they understood who she was, and why she had come to be alone in a blizzard on the edge of his territory. For now, there was only the quiet work of keeping her alive, and the unspoken understanding settling over the den that whatever came next, this fragile stranger had already become, in some small but undeniable way, their responsibility. Outside, the storm continued to rage through the night, burying the ravine where she had fallen deeper beneath layers of snow, erasing any trace that she had ever been there at all. But inside the den, warmth slowly returned to her limbs, and though she remained unconscious, her breathing steadied, growing stronger with each passing hour, as if some part of her recognized that she had, against every terrible odds stacked against her, found somewhere safe to land. By the time the first gray light of morning began to filter weakly through the storm clouds, Mira's breathing had settled into something closer to natural sleep than the shallow, uncertain rhythm of earlier that night. Grace remained close by throughout, occasionally adjusting the furs layered over her, monitoring the slow return of warmth to her body with the quiet vigilance of someone who understood exactly how fragile recovery could be after exposure this severe. The rest of the den had gradually settled as well, though sleep did not come easily to many of them. Owen sat near the entrance for a long while, unable to shake the image of how still she had looked when he first found her, how close they had come to being too late. Elena checked on her twice during the night, each time finding Mira's condition slightly improved, each time feeling a little more of the tension in her own shoulders ease. Cade did not sleep at all. He remained near the fire for much of the night, watching the stranger's steady breathing, turning over questions in his mind that had no answers yet. Who was she? Where had she come from? What had happened to leave old bruises layered beneath new ones? What had driven her alone into a storm that had nearly killed her? He was not a wolf who acted on sentiment alone, and yet something about her circumstances refused to let his thoughts settle into simple caution. As dawn approached, and the worst of the storm finally began to weaken outside, Mira stirred for the first time, a small shift of movement that immediately drew every eye in the den toward her. Her breathing changed rhythm, her brow furrowing slightly, as consciousness began, slowly and painfully, to return. She did not wake fully, not yet, but the change was enough to tell everyone watching that she had survived the night, that whatever had brought her to their doorstep, she would live to explain it herself. Grace allowed herself a small, tired smile at the sight, the first real relief she had felt since Mira had been carried through the den's entrance hours earlier. Behind her, Cade watched in silence, his expression unreadable, though something in his posture had shifted almost imperceptibly, the wariness of the night before giving way, just slightly, to something closer to cautious relief. Outside, the wind finally began to soften, the worst of the blizzard passing as morning light spread slowly across the snow-covered land. Inside, in the warmth of the den, a wolf who had been cast out from everything she once knew, took her first steps back toward consciousness, entirely unaware that the wolves gathered around her, strangers to her in every sense, had already begun, without quite realizing it themselves, to care whether she lived or died. Mira woke slowly, her senses returning in pieces rather than all at once. First came warmth, unfamiliar and almost disorienting after so many hours of bitter cold. Then came the scent, unfamiliar wolves, unfamiliar den, unfamiliar earth beneath the furs she lay upon. Her eyes fluttered open, and for a long moment, she simply stared upward at a rocky ceiling she did not recognize, trying to piece together how she had come to be here at all. Panic arrived a moment later, sharp and immediate. She pushed herself upright too quickly, her body protesting with a wave of dizziness that forced her to steady herself against the ground. Her mind raced through fragmented memories, the storm, the cold, the moment she had stopped fighting to stay conscious. She remembered none of what had happened after that, and the gap between then and now felt like a void she could not safely cross. A voice spoke gently from nearby, calm and unhurried, urging her not to move too quickly. Mira turned toward the sound and found an older female wolf watching her with careful, assessing eyes, though there was no hostility in her expression, only quiet concern. This was Grace, though Mira did not yet know her name, and something about the steadiness in her voice helped ease, just slightly, the panic clawing at Mira's chest. Mira's eyes moved past Grace, taking in the rest of the den for the first time. Several other wolves stood or sat at a respectful distance, watching her with expressions ranging from open curiosity to guarded wariness. None of them approached. None of them spoke. The silence stretched long enough that Mira began to wonder if she had simply traded one kind of danger for another, waking from a blizzard, only to find herself surrounded by strangers who had every reason to see her as an intruder. She tried to speak, her voice coming out rough and cracked from disuse. She managed only a single word, a quiet question asking where she was, before her throat closed around the effort, and she fell silent again. Grace answered for her, explaining simply that she was safe, that she had been found in the snow and brought here to recover, that no harm was intended toward her, so long as she meant none toward them. The words did little to fully calm the tight knot of fear still lodged in Mira's chest, but they were enough to keep her from bolting, though in her weakened state, she doubted she could have run far even if she tried. She let herself sink back down against the furs, exhaustion pulling at her despite the fear still humming beneath her skin. It was then that she noticed him, standing slightly apart from the others near the den's entrance, watching her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken. She did not know his name yet, did not know that he was the alpha of this territory, but something in his bearing told her instinctively that he held authority here, that whatever judgment came next would likely come from him. Cade said nothing for a long moment, his gaze steady and unreadable as he studied her. Mira forced herself to meet his eyes despite every instinct urging her to look away, to make herself smaller, less noticeable. She had learned, painfully, what happened when she let herself appear weak in front of wolves who held power over her fate. She would not make that mistake again, not even here, not even now, exhausted and vulnerable as she was. Finally, Cade spoke, his voice measured, neither warm nor unkind, simply direct. He asked her name. He asked where she had come from, and why she had been alone in his territory during a storm severe enough to kill wolves twice her size. Mira hesitated, unsure how much to reveal, unsure whether honesty would help or harm her here, but something in his steady gaze, some quiet insistence that he would know if she lied, convinced her that deception was not a path worth risking. She told him her name. She told him, briefly and without elaboration, that she had been exiled from her pack, that she had been walking without direction when the storm caught her, that she had not meant to cross into anyone's territory, only to find somewhere she might survive the night. She did not explain why she had been exiled. She was not yet ready to relive that particular humiliation in front of strangers, who had no reason to believe her version of events, over whatever assumptions they might already be forming. Exile alone was often enough to make other wolves suspicious, regardless of the reasons behind it, and she braced herself for the same wariness she had grown used to in her final days among her own pack. Cade studied her for a long moment after she finished speaking, and Mira could not tell what conclusions he was drawing from her brief, guarded account. Around the den, she was aware of the other wolves watching closely as well, some with open curiosity, others with expressions carefully guarded, giving nothing away. It was Victor who broke the silence first, his voice carrying a skepticism that Mira had half expected to encounter eventually, though she had hoped it might take longer to surface. He asked pointedly what crime had led to her exile, his tone making clear that he doubted whatever answer she might give would be the full truth. Mira felt her spine stiffen at the implied accusation, old defensiveness rising quickly to the surface, though she forced herself to keep her voice level as she answered. She told him she had been accused of theft, of stealing from the pack's shared stores during a difficult season, though she had done nothing of the sort. She told him the truth had not mattered, that the wolf who accused her held more influence than she did, and that the pack's leadership had chosen the easier path of believing him, rather than investigating further. She did not expect Victor, or anyone else in this den, to believe her. She had learned that innocence rarely mattered once suspicion had already taken root in others' minds. To her surprise, it was not disbelief that met her explanation, but a thoughtful, considering silence. Elena, who had said little until this point, finally spoke, asking gently whether Mira had any way to prove what she claimed. Mira shook her head slowly, admitting that she did not, that she had left with nothing but the fur on her back, and whatever strength remained in her legs to carry her away from a place that no longer wanted her. Cade remained quiet through this exchange, his expression giving little away, though Mira noticed the way his eyes lingered on the old bruising visible beneath her thinning fur, injuries that predated the storm entirely. She saw the question forming behind his gaze, even before he voiced it, asking simply how she had come to be injured before the blizzard ever caught her. Mira's throat tightened at the question, memories rising unbidden of the final confrontation before her exile, of wolves who had once called themselves her friends, turning cold and distant the moment accusations were leveled against her, of the physical toll that came with being forcibly removed from territory she had called home her entire life. She did not want to relive those details aloud. Not here, not in front of wolves who owed her nothing and had no obligation to believe a single word she said. She answered simply that the journey had been difficult, that the terrain between her old territory and this one had not been kind, leaving the deeper truth unspoken. It was not entirely a lie, though it was far from the complete picture, and she suspected Cade sensed the omission, even as he chose not to press further, at least for now. The tension in the den remained thick, despite the pause in questioning. Mira could feel the weight of many eyes upon her, could sense the careful calculations happening behind each watching gaze, as the wolves around her tried to decide what to make of this stranger who had fallen, quite literally, into the middle of their territory. She understood their caution, even as it frayed at her already thin patience. She had been on the receiving end of unfair judgment too recently to fully trust that this new pack would treat her any differently than her old one had. Cade finally broke the lingering silence, his tone shifting slightly, though Mira could not quite read what the shift meant. He told her that she would be allowed to remain until she had recovered enough strength to travel safely, that Frostback territory was no place for a wolf as weakened as she currently was to attempt crossing alone, regardless of the circumstances that had brought her here. But he made clear, in the same breath, that this arrangement was temporary, that her presence here did not grant her any claim to territory or protection beyond what basic decency required. Mira nodded, understanding the boundaries being drawn even as something in her chest ached at how conditional this shelter felt, how quickly it could be withdrawn should these wolves decide she was more trouble than her recovery was worth. She had learned not to expect kindness without conditions attached, and she told herself firmly not to mistake temporary shelter for anything resembling true belonging. As the morning wore on, the den slowly returned to something resembling normal activity, wolves moving about their usual routines, though Mira remained keenly aware of the occasional glances thrown her way, some curious, some still openly suspicious. She kept mostly still, conserving what little strength she had, watching the unfamiliar rhythms of this pack with the wary attentiveness of someone determined not to overstay whatever welcome she had been granted. It was a young pup, barely more than a few seasons old, who first approached her without hesitation, apparently untouched by the caution that governed the adults around her. The pup, a small female with bright, curious eyes, sat down a short distance away and simply stared at Mira with open fascination, clearly unaware of, or unconcerned by, the complicated tension surrounding the stranger's arrival. Mira found herself unexpectedly moved by the pup's simple lack of judgment, a small crack of warmth breaking through the numb exhaustion that had settled over her since waking. She offered a tentative smile, and the pup, apparently satisfied by this small gesture, shuffled slightly closer, though still keeping a respectful distance, as if some instinct told her not to crowd the tired stranger too much. An older female appeared moments later, gently calling the pup back with a tone that carried both affection and mild reprimand. The pup obeyed reluctantly, casting one last curious glance back toward Mira before trotting off to rejoin the safer company of her own kind. Mira watched her go, a strange mixture of loneliness and quiet gratitude settling over her at the brief, uncomplicated interaction. As the day stretched onward, exhaustion eventually pulled Mira back into sleep, deeper and less troubled than her earlier waking had been. She did not dream, or if she did not remember it upon waking again sometime later, the light outside the den having shifted noticeably toward evening. When she woke this second time, Grace was nearby again, checking on her recovery with the same steady professional care as before. She informed Mira gently that her fever, something Mira had not even fully registered during her earlier waking, had broken sometime during the afternoon, a sign that her body was finally beginning to recover from the worst effects of her exposure to the storm. Mira thanked her quietly, unused to receiving care so freely given, without expectation of repayment or ulterior motive. Grace waved off the gratitude simply, explaining that tending to injuries and illness was simply her role within the pack, nothing more remarkable than that. But Mira suspected, even in her limited understanding of this new pack's dynamics, that Grace's kindness ran deeper than mere duty. As evening settled fully over the den, the storm outside finally exhausted itself entirely, leaving behind a world blanketed thickly in fresh snow, silent and still, under a sky finally clearing of clouds. Mira could see glimpses of it through the den's entrance, moonlight beginning to filter weakly across the pristine white landscape, beautiful in a way that felt strangely at odds with how close that same landscape had come to killing her only a day earlier. She thought, as she watched the quiet scene beyond the entrance, of how strange fate could be, how a storm meant to end her life had instead delivered her, however temporarily, into the care of strangers who owed her nothing yet had chosen, for reasons she did not fully understand, not to turn her away. She did not know what would happen once her strength returned fully, whether these wolves would honor Cade's promise of temporary shelter or find reason to reconsider even that limited kindness. But for tonight at least, she was warm. For tonight at least, she was alive, and that alone felt like more than she had dared hope for only a day before. Sleep claimed her again as the den settled into its evening quiet, wolves drifting toward rest as the moon rose higher over the newly fallen snow. Mira's dreams, when they finally came, were not of her exile, nor of the storm that had nearly ended her. They were simply of warmth, of quiet, of the strange, fragile beginning of something she did not yet have words for, though some small part of her, buried beneath exhaustion and lingering fear, had already begun, cautiously, to hope. 3 days passed before Mira felt steady enough on her legs to move about the den without assistance. Grace checked on her each morning, pleased with the slow but steady improvement she saw, the color returning to Mira's fur, the strength gradually rebuilding in limbs that had nearly failed her entirely during the storm. Mira herself felt the change too, the fog of exhaustion lifting bit by bit, replaced by a sharper awareness of her surroundings, and, increasingly, a restless discomfort at how dependent she had become on wolves, who had no true obligation to care for her at all. She began, on the third morning, to look for small ways to make herself useful, unwilling to simply lie among the furs accepting charity, while others moved about their daily responsibilities around her. She noticed a pile of torn bedding materials near the den's edge, furs and woven grasses that had been damaged during the worst of the storm, and without asking permission, she settled herself nearby and began, carefully and methodically, to mend what she could. Her hands, still weak from her ordeal, fumbled more than she would have liked, but she persisted, finding a strange comfort in the simple, repetitive work. It reminded her of quieter days before her exile, of afternoons spent mending and preparing alongside her mother, before everything in her life had unraveled so completely. The memory brought a familiar ache, but she pushed through it, focusing instead on the task in front of her. Elena noticed her efforts first, pausing on her way past to watch for a moment before offering a quiet word of approval. She mentioned that the bedding had needed mending for days, that no one else had found the time between other duties to attend to it properly. Mira accepted the small compliment with a nod, unused to receiving praise so freely, though something in her chest warmed slightly at the acknowledgement. Word of her quiet industriousness spread slowly through the den over the following days. Small observations passed between wolves who had initially regarded her with suspicion now beginning to shift, gradually, into something closer to cautious respect. She did not seek attention for her efforts, did not draw notice to herself beyond what the work itself naturally required, and this quiet humility seemed to ease, bit by bit, some of the wariness that had greeted her arrival. Still, not everyone within the den shared this softening perspective. Victor remained openly skeptical of her presence, his suspicion showing itself in pointed glances and occasional comments made just loud enough for her to overhear, though never quite direct enough to warrant open confrontation. Mira did her best to ignore these moments, though they wore at her patience more than she cared to admit, each dismissive remark reopening old wounds from accusations she had already endured once before. It was during one such moment, several days into her stay, that tensions finally rose to the surface. Mira had been helping gather firewood alongside a small group of younger wolves, her strength largely restored by this point, when Victor approached with an expression that immediately told her this encounter would not be pleasant. He questioned openly, In front of the others, why the pack continued to shelter a wolf whose story could not be verified, whose exile might well have been justified despite her insistence otherwise. Mira felt heat rise beneath her fur, old frustration and fresh humiliation combining into something sharp and difficult to suppress. She had grown weary of defending herself against assumptions she could not fully disprove, weary of being asked to justify her own existence to wolves who had already decided, in their own minds, what kind of creature she must be. She opened her mouth to respond, uncertain even herself what words might emerge, when another voice cut through the tension before she could speak. Owen, the scout who had originally found her in the snow, stepped forward with unexpected firmness, reminding Victor that the pack's decision to shelter her had already been made, that questioning her worth repeatedly served no purpose beyond causing unnecessary discord within the den. His defense of her surprised Mira nearly as much as it seemed to surprise Victor, who fell silent, though his expression remained unconvinced. The confrontation ended without further escalation, the small group returning to their work in an uneasy quiet that lingered for the rest of the afternoon. Mira found herself grateful for Owen's intervention, though the encounter left her rattled, a reminder of how precarious her position within this pack truly remained, regardless of the small progress she had made toward acceptance. That evening, as the den settled into its usual quiet rhythms, Mira found herself seeking out a solitary corner, needing distance from the watchful eyes that had followed her more closely than usual since the confrontation. She sat near the entrance, watching the moonlight stretch long shadows across the snow, her thoughts tangled between gratitude for Owen's defense and frustration at how quickly her fragile sense of safety could still be shaken. She did not notice Cade's approach until he settled himself nearby, close enough to speak quietly without disturbing the rest of the den. He said nothing at first, simply sitting beside her in companionable silence for several long moments, before finally speaking, his voice carrying none of the guarded formality he had shown during their earlier conversations. He acknowledged, without prompting, that he had witnessed the confrontation with Victor earlier that day, and that he understood how difficult it must be for her to continually defend herself against suspicion she had done nothing to earn. Mira glanced at him, surprised by the unexpected acknowledgement, unsure how to respond to an alpha who seemed, however cautiously, to be extending something resembling sympathy. She admitted quietly that she had grown tired of proving herself worthy of basic decency, that the exhaustion of constant justification weighed on her nearly as heavily as the physical toll of her exile and journey had. Cade listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful as she spoke, and when she finished, he offered no easy reassurances, no empty promises that the wariness of others would simply disappear. Instead, he told her, honestly, that trust within his pack was earned slowly, that the caution shown toward her was not born of cruelty, but of necessity, given how vulnerable his pack remained to threats they could not always anticipate. Mira considered his words carefully, finding in them a strange kind of comfort, despite their lack of easy sympathy. There was an honesty in his approach that she had not expected, a refusal to offer false comfort simply to smooth over an uncomfortable conversation. She found herself, somewhat unexpectedly, respecting him more for that honesty than she might have for empty reassurance. She asked him then, hesitantly, why he had chosen to shelter her at all, given how much easier it would have been to simply turn her away or leave her fate to the storm entirely. Cade was quiet for a long moment before answering, his gaze fixed on the moonlit snow beyond the den's entrance, rather than on her directly. He told her, eventually, that he had lost someone once, long before he became Alpha, someone left to fend for themselves during circumstances not entirely unlike her own, and that he had sworn, in the aftermath of that loss, never to make the same choice again if the opportunity to prevent it ever arose. He did not elaborate further, and Mira did not press him to, sensing instinctively that this admission had cost him something to share, that it was not offered lightly. The conversation lapsed into comfortable silence after that, both of them content simply to sit together, watching the quiet night stretch across the snow-covered territory. For the first time since her arrival, Mira felt something shift within her. Not quite trust, not yet, but the first fragile seeds of something that might eventually grow into it, given enough time and enough small moments like this one. Over the following days, The tension surrounding her presence did not disappear entirely, but it softened noticeably, particularly after word spread of Cade's evident, if understated, support for her continued shelter. Wolves who had previously kept their distance began, gradually, to include her in small ways, offering brief conversations during shared meals, inviting her participation in minor daily tasks that required more than one set of paws to accomplish efficiently. Mira welcomed these small gestures cautiously, still wary of investing too much hope in a belonging that remained, in her own mind, entirely temporary. She reminded herself frequently that Cade's original terms had been clear, that her presence here was meant to last only until her strength returned fully, that she should not allow herself to grow too comfortable in a place that had never promised to be permanent. And yet, despite these careful reminders, something within her continued, quietly and against her own better judgment, to hope. She noticed it most in small moments: the warmth of shared laughter during evening gatherings around the fire, the simple comfort of Grace's continued attentiveness to her recovery, the increasingly frequent presence of the small, curious pup who had first approached her without hesitation and who now sought her out regularly, apparently having decided, in the straightforward way of young pups, that Mira was someone worth spending time around. The pup's name, Mira learned during one such visit, was Lily, and her open affection provided a welcome counterbalance to the lingering wariness of some of the pack's older members. Lily asked endless questions, curious about everything from Mira's old territory to the details of her journey through the storm, and Mira found herself answering more openly than she had with anyone else since her arrival, the innocent curiosity somehow easier to navigate than the guarded suspicion of the adults around her. Through these small, accumulating moments, Mira began to notice a shift within herself as well, a gradual softening of the defensive walls she had built during her final difficult days among her old pack. She still carried caution with her, still remained alert to the possibility that this fragile peace could shatter without warning, but beneath that caution, something else had begun, slowly and tentatively, to take root, a feeling she had not expected to experience again so soon after losing everything familiar to her. It was not quite belonging, not yet. But it was, perhaps, the beginning of something that might one day become exactly that, provided she allowed herself the courage to keep believing it possible. A full turning of the moon passed before Mira realized just how much her presence within the den had shifted from tolerated to, in some quiet way, expected. She noticed it first in small habits that had formed without her fully realizing, the way Grace now automatically saved her a portion of food during shared meals, the way Lily bounded toward her each morning with unfiltered enthusiasm, the way even Elena had begun including her in conversations about the pack's daily needs, as though her opinion genuinely mattered to the decisions being made. Still, beneath this gradually warming acceptance, an undercurrent of unresolved tension remained, most visibly embodied in Victor's continued, if less openly hostile, skepticism. He had not repeated his earlier confrontation, chastened perhaps by Owen's unexpected defense and Cade's evident support, but his distrust had not vanished either, merely retreated into quieter, more watchful observation. Mira felt his eyes on her often, felt the weight of his continued doubt even when he said nothing directly. She understood, in a distant, exhausted way, that some wariness might never fully dissolve, that certain wolves simply required more than a moon's worth of quiet good behavior before extending genuine trust. She told herself this understanding did not bother her, though the persistent ache of being perpetually judged suggested otherwise. It was during a routine hunting expedition, one of the first Mira had been permitted to join since her strength fully returned, that circumstances finally forced a different kind of reckoning. The pack had tracked a small herd of deer deeper into the forest than usual, following signs that suggested easier prey than they had encountered in recent weeks. Mira, though still cautious about overstepping her uncertain position, had proven herself capable enough during smaller tasks that Cade had extended an invitation to join this larger hunt, a decision that had drawn quiet surprise from several pack members, Victor included. The hunt progressed smoothly at first, the pack working in practiced coordination to corner their prey against a natural ravine that limited the herd's escape routes. Mira found herself falling into the familiar rhythms of a coordinated hunt with surprising ease. Her instincts, honed over years within her old pack, translating naturally into cooperation with wolves she had known for barely a month. She caught herself, in a brief, unguarded moment, feeling something close to genuine belonging as she moved alongside Elena and Owen, anticipating their movements, almost as if she had hunted beside them for seasons rather than weeks. The moment shattered abruptly when the terrain beneath Victor's paws gave way unexpectedly. A hidden crevice concealed beneath a thin layer of snow and brush, collapsing under his weight as he pursued a break in the herd. He fell hard, his cry of alarm cutting sharply through the coordinated quiet of the hunt, and the herd scattered instantly in the chaos, the opportunity for a successful hunt vanishing in a matter of seconds. Mira reacted without conscious thought, breaking away from her position to reach the ravine's edge, and peering down to find Victor several body lengths below, struggling against an awkward angle that suggested his leg had been injured in the fall. The drop was steep, the sides slick with ice and loose rock, dangerous terrain for any attempt at rescue. Several other wolves arrived moments later, Owen and Elena among them, all peering down with expressions of growing concern, as Victor called up that he could not find solid footing to climb back out on his own. The ravine's walls offered few reliable handholds, and the risk of further injury, or of a second wolf becoming trapped in a failed rescue attempt, was immediately apparent to everyone gathered at the edge. It was Mira who moved first, scanning the terrain with a critical eye before identifying a narrow ledge partway down the ravine's slope, a possible path that might allow careful, controlled descent if navigated precisely. She announced her intention before anyone could object, already lowering herself over the edge, testing each foothold carefully before committing her full weight to it. Elena called out a warning, urging caution, clearly torn between the necessity of reaching Victor quickly and the danger of losing a second wolf to the treacherous footing. Mira did not slow her careful descent, focusing entirely on the path immediately ahead of her, drawing on skills she had developed navigating difficult terrain during her own journey through the storm weeks earlier. Where others hesitated, uncertain of the ravine's dangers, Mira moved with the particular confidence of someone who had already survived far worse than a steep, icy slope. She reached Victor several minutes later, breathing hard from the effort, immediately assessing the injury to his leg with careful hands. It was not broken, she determined with visible relief, though it was badly strained, swollen enough that putting weight on it would be both painful and unwise until proper care could be administered. Victor watched her assessment with an expression that mixed pain, frustration at his own vulnerability, and something else, something that looked almost like reluctant gratitude, though he said nothing to acknowledge it directly. Getting him back up the ravine proved far more difficult than Mira's descent alone had been. She positioned herself beneath his uninjured side, offering steady support as he attempted, with obvious effort, to climb using the same careful path she had identified on her way down. Above them, Owen and Elena worked to secure additional support from the ravine's edge, calling down encouragement and guidance as the slow, difficult climb progressed. It took considerable time, and more than one heart-stopping moment where Victor's grip slipped against the icy rock, but eventually, with Mira's steady support and the combined effort of the wolves waiting above, they emerged safely from the ravine, both exhausted, both shaking slightly from the strain of the ordeal, but both, crucially, unharmed beyond the initial injury to Victor's leg. The rest of the pack immediately surrounded them, relief evident in every expression, questions and reassurances overlapping, as Victor was carefully helped toward more level ground, where his leg could be properly examined and treated. Mira stepped back from the commotion, suddenly uncertain of her place, amid the chaos of relief and gratitude swirling around her rescue effort, unused to being at the center of such visible concern and appreciation. It was Victor himself who finally addressed her directly, once the immediate crisis had passed and his leg had been carefully bound to prevent further strain during the journey back to the den. He met her eyes with an expression far different from the skepticism he had shown her throughout the previous weeks, something humbled and genuinely grateful, replacing the wariness that had defined his interactions with her until this moment. He thanked her plainly, without elaboration, acknowledging that her quick action and steady nerve had likely prevented his injury from becoming significantly worse, perhaps even prevented a far more serious outcome entirely. Mira accepted the gratitude with quiet surprise, uncertain how to respond to an acknowledgement she had not expected to ever receive from him specifically. He continued, after a brief pause, admitting that his doubts about her had been unfair, that he had allowed his caution about strangers to override his judgment of her actual character she had now demonstrated clearly through actions rather than words alone. It was, Mira understood, as close to a genuine apology as Victor was likely to offer, and she found herself appreciating the honesty of it more than any more elaborate expression of regret might have provided. The journey back to the den that evening carried a noticeably different atmosphere than the hunt's chaotic ending had suggested it might. Wolves who had previously kept a polite but guarded distance from Mira now walked closer beside her, conversation flowing more easily, the earlier tension surrounding her presence within the pack visibly loosening with each shared word and glance. Cade, who had been leading a separate portion of the hunting party and had only just been informed of the ravine incident upon their return, sought Mira out personally once they reached the safety of the den. He listened carefully as others recounted the details of what had happened, his expression carrying an unmistakable pride that Mira had not seen directed toward her before, and when the recounting finished, he simply nodded once, a small gesture that nonetheless carried significant weight given his usual reserve. He told her quietly, once the others had dispersed to attend to their evening routines, that her actions today had spoken more clearly than any explanation she might have offered about her past ever could. Mira felt something loosen in her chest at his words, a tension she had been carrying since her arrival easing, if only slightly, at this acknowledgement from the wolf, whose judgment mattered most within this pack's hierarchy. That night, as the den settled into its familiar evening quiet, Mira found herself surrounded by a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire burning steadily nearby. Wolves who had once regarded her with suspicion now offered genuine smiles, genuine conversation, genuine inclusion in the easy camaraderie that flowed naturally among pack members who trusted one another. She was not yet fully one of them, she understood that clearly, but the distance between where she stood now and true belonging had narrowed considerably since that morning's hunt had taken its unexpected, dangerous turn. Lily curled up beside her that evening, with characteristic ease, apparently having decided long ago what the rest of the pack had only now begun to fully accept. Mira allowed herself, for the first time since her exile, to relax fully into the comfort of the moment, the warmth of acceptance settling over her, like something she had genuinely earned rather than merely been granted out of temporary necessity. Outside, the night sky stretched clear and star-filled above the snow-covered territory, the storm that had first brought her here, now a distant memory rather than an ongoing threat. Inside, surrounded by wolves who had begun, in ways both small and significant, to welcome her as something more than a temporary guest, Mira allowed herself, cautiously but genuinely, to hope that perhaps this place might become something she had never expected to find again after her exile. A home. Weeks passed, and with them came a gradual, comfortable rhythm that Mira had not expected to find again so soon, after losing everything familiar to her. She rose each morning alongside the rest of the pack, sharing in the small, necessary tasks that kept the den functioning smoothly, gathering firewood, checking territory markers, assisting Grace with the ongoing care of a young wolf recovering from a minor illness. The work suited her, gave her purpose, and more importantly, gave her a sense of contribution that made the shelter she had been offered feel less like charity and more like genuine partnership. Cade noticed her steady dedication, though he said little about it directly, preferring instead to demonstrate his growing trust through action rather than words. He began including her in discussions about the pack's territory, seeking her perspective on decisions that affected the group as a whole, a level of inclusion that surprised Mira each time it occurred, given how recently she had been nothing more than an unwelcome stranger, discovered half frozen at the edge of his land. It was during one such discussion, held around the fire on a particularly cold evening, that Mira first noticed a change in how Cade regarded her when he believed she was not watching closely. She caught him, more than once, studying her, with an expression that carried something beyond simple leadership evaluation, something warmer, more personal, though he quickly masked it whenever their eyes met directly. She told herself she was imagining things, that exhaustion and the strangeness of her new circumstances were leading her to read significance into glances that meant nothing more than ordinary attentiveness. And yet, the observation lingered in her mind longer than she cared to admit, resurfacing in quiet moments, when her thoughts drifted unbidden toward the alpha who had, against considerable odds, chosen to shelter her when he had every reason not to. Elena, perceptive as always, seemed to notice something shifting as well, offering Mira knowing glances during shared meals that Mira pretended not to understand, though the warmth rising beneath her fur likely gave away more than she intended. She was not ready to examine too closely whatever budding feeling might be growing within her, uncertain whether such feelings belonged in a life still so recently upended, still so uncertain in its permanence. The pack's acceptance of her, meanwhile, continued to deepen in ways both large and small. Lily had become nearly inseparable from her during quiet hours, following Mira through her daily tasks with the boundless enthusiasm particular to young pups still discovering the world around them. Mira found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, genuinely enjoying the pup's company, finding in her uncomplicated affection a balm for wounds that had not fully healed, despite the weeks of relative peace she had now experienced within Frostback territory. Even Victor, whose skepticism had once seemed nearly immovable, had transformed into something approaching genuine friendship, the shared experience of the ravine rescue having forged a connection between them that neither had anticipated. He sought her company more frequently now, engaging her in conversations about hunting strategy and territory management that revealed a thoughtful, considered mind beneath his initially gruff exterior. Despite this growing sense of belonging, Mira remained aware, in quieter moments, of the precariousness underlying her position. She was still, technically, an outsider, a wolf without formal claim to this territory or this pack, existing here through Cade's continued goodwill rather than any established right. The thought unsettled her more than she wished to admit, a persistent reminder that everything she had gained here could, theoretically, be withdrawn should circumstances shift unexpectedly. This uncertainty came to a head one evening when a visiting wolf arrived at the territory's edge, requesting audience with Cade regarding matters unrelated, initially, to Mira's presence within the pack. The visitor, a lean, watchful wolf named Daniel, carried news from territories further south, news of shifting alliances and disputed borders that required careful diplomatic navigation to avoid unnecessary conflict. Mira remained at a respectful distance during the initial exchange, understanding instinctively that pack diplomacy fell outside her current standing within the group. But something in Daniel's expression shifted when his gaze happened to fall upon her, a flicker of recognition crossing his features that immediately set Mira's instincts on edge. He excused himself briefly from his conversation with Cade, approaching Mira with careful, measured steps, his expression unreadable, in a way that reminded her uncomfortably of the political maneuvering that had characterized the final days within her old pack. He addressed her by name, confirming what his expression had already suggested, that he recognized her, that news of her exile had apparently traveled further than she had realized. Mira's chest tightened with immediate apprehension, old fears resurfacing at the possibility that whatever reputation had followed her exile might now threaten the fragile stability she had built within this new pack. She braced herself for accusation, for the same doubt and suspicion that had first greeted her arrival here, wondering whether Daniel's news might undo weeks of carefully earned trust in a matter of moments. To her surprise, and considerable relief, Daniel's expression carried no hostility, only careful curiosity. He explained that word of her exile had indeed spread through certain circles, though the details surrounding it remained murky and disputed, even among wolves who claimed familiarity with the situation. He mentioned, cautiously, that some among her old pack had begun quietly questioning whether the accusations against her had been entirely fair, whispers of doubt spreading slowly in the aftermath of her departure. Mira absorbed this information with a complicated mixture of vindication and lingering hurt, the knowledge that some within her old pack might now doubt the injustice done to her arriving too late to have prevented the pain of her exile in the first place. She thanked Daniel for the information, though her voice carried little warmth, the wound of her betrayal still too fresh to fully appreciate this delayed, uncertain vindication. Cade, who had listened to this exchange with growing attention, stepped forward once Daniel finished speaking, his expression carrying a protective firmness that Mira had not witnessed directed toward her before. He made clear, in tones that left no room for misunderstanding, that whatever doubts lingered about Mira's exile mattered little to him, that her actions and character since arriving within his territory had already established, beyond any reasonable question, the kind of wolf she truly was. The declaration, delivered with such unequivocal certainty, struck Mira more deeply than she expected, a warmth spreading through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire burning nearby. She had grown so accustomed to defending herself, to justifying her worth against doubt and suspicion, that Cade's unprompted defense felt like something entirely new, a kind of protection she had not experienced since long before her exile had upended everything she once understood about belonging and trust. Daniel, apparently satisfied with Cade's clear stance on the matter, offered a respectful nod before returning to the diplomatic discussions that had originally brought him to Frostback territory. Mira remained rooted in place for several long moments after his departure, processing the unexpected turn the encounter had taken, the strange mixture of vulnerability and gratitude settling uneasily within her chest. Cade lingered nearby, apparently sensing that she needed a moment before returning to her usual composure. When she finally met his eyes, she found none of the guarded distance that had characterized their earlier interactions, only steady, genuine concern that made her breath catch slightly in her throat. He asked, quietly, whether she was all right, whether Daniel's news had disturbed her more than she was letting on. Mira considered the question carefully, before answering honestly, that she was uncertain how to feel. That vindication delayed by weeks of suffering felt somehow both meaningful and hollow simultaneously. A complicated emotion she had not anticipated needing to navigate. Cade nodded slowly, seeming to understand the complexity of her response, without requiring further explanation. He told her simply that regardless of what her old pack eventually came to believe or admit, her place here did not depend on their validation, that she had already proven herself, through her own actions and character, worthy of the trust and belonging she had found within Frostback territory. The words settled over Mira like something solid and reassuring, a foundation she had not realized she still needed until it was offered so plainly. She thanked him quietly, unable to fully articulate the depth of gratitude she felt in that moment, though something in her expression must have conveyed at least part of what words could not. That night, as the pack settled into its familiar evening rhythms, Mira found herself thinking less about the uncertain vindication Daniel's news had offered, and more about the steady, unwavering support Cade had shown throughout the encounter. She recognized, with growing clarity, that whatever careful feeling had been building within her over recent weeks was no longer something she could easily dismiss as imagination or exhaustion. It had become something real, something she would need, eventually, to acknowledge fully, regardless of how uncertain or complicated such feelings might prove to navigate within the delicate balance of her still evolving place within this pack. For now, though, she allowed herself simply to feel grateful for the shelter that had become something closer to home, for the wolves who had gradually become something closer to family, and for the quiet, steady presence of an alpha whose protection had come to mean more to her than she was fully ready to admit, even to herself. The days following Daniel's visit passed with a quiet warmth that Mira found herself savoring more deliberately than before, aware now of how fragile such contentment could prove if circumstances shifted unexpectedly. She continued her daily routines within the den, but something had shifted subtly in how she approached them, a lightness in her step that had not been present during her earlier, more guarded weeks among the pack. Cade's protective declaration had not gone unnoticed by the rest of the pack, and in the days that followed, Mira noticed a further softening in how the remaining skeptical members regarded her. Even those who had maintained polite but distant caution throughout her recovery now greeted her with genuine warmth, apparently taking their alpha's clear endorsement as final confirmation of her trustworthiness. Elena, ever perceptive, took the opportunity of a quiet afternoon spent gathering herbs together to broach the subject Mira had been carefully avoiding even within her own thoughts. She asked, with gentle directness, whether Mira had noticed the way Cade's attention toward her had changed in recent weeks, whether the growing warmth between them extended beyond simple pack loyalty. Mira felt heat rise beneath her fur at the question, momentarily unable to formulate a response that did not betray more than she was ready to admit. Elena laughed softly at her evident discomfort, not unkindly, assuring her that such feelings, should they exist, were nothing to be embarrassed about, that Cade himself had seemed unusually preoccupied with Mira's well-being since the day Owen first brought her into the den. The conversation left Mira's thoughts unsettled for the remainder of the day, turning over Elena's observations with a mixture of hope and lingering caution. She had spent so long focused simply on survival, on rebuilding some semblance of stability after her exile, that she had not allowed herself to consider what deeper connections might eventually grow from the shelter she had found here. The possibility, once acknowledged, proved difficult to set aside entirely. That evening, as the pack gathered for their usual shared meal, Mira found herself seated, as had become customary, near Cade, their conversation flowing with an ease that had developed gradually over the preceding weeks. She studied him more carefully than usual throughout the meal, noticing details she had perhaps registered before without fully acknowledging their significance: the quiet strength in his bearing, the fairness that guided his leadership decisions, the unexpected gentleness he showed toward the pack's younger members despite his formidable presence as alpha. Cade, for his part, seemed similarly attentive throughout the meal, his focus returning to her more frequently than strict pack business would necessarily require. When their eyes met unexpectedly during a lull in conversation, neither looked away immediately, a charged silence stretching between them that neither seemed inclined to break, until Lily's characteristic enthusiasm interrupted the moment, the young pup bounding over to demand Mira's attention for some minor discovery she was eager to share. The interruption broke whatever delicate tension had been building, though Mira noticed, as she turned her attention toward Lily's excited chatter, a small, knowing smile crossing Elena's face from across the fire, confirming that their earlier conversation had not been entirely one-sided observation on Elena's part alone. Over the following days, small moments of connection between Mira and Cade continued to accumulate, quiet conversations that stretched longer than pack business strictly required, shared glances that carried warmth beyond simple friendly regard, a gradual, careful drawing closer, that neither explicitly acknowledged but that both, Mira suspected, were equally aware of navigating. It was during a routine border patrol, one that Cade had specifically requested Mira accompany him on, citing her growing familiarity with the territory's edges, that the careful distance between them finally began to dissolve more explicitly. They walked together along the frost-covered boundary, conversation drifting naturally from practical matters of territory management toward more personal reflections neither had shared so openly before. Mira found herself speaking more freely than she had with anyone since her exile, describing details of her life before the accusations that upended everything, memories of her mother, of quieter days spent learning the intricacies of pack life before politics and jealousy had torn her world apart. Cade listened with genuine attentiveness, offering his own reflections in turn, speaking of the responsibilities of leadership, of the loss he had experienced years earlier that had shaped his particular commitment to protecting those who found themselves vulnerable and alone. As their conversation deepened, they eventually paused near a ridge overlooking a valley, bathed in the soft, golden light of late afternoon, the beauty of the landscape momentarily silencing them both as they took in the view together. Mira felt acutely aware of Cade's presence beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him, despite the chill still lingering in the winter air. Cade broke the silence first, his voice quieter and more uncertain than she had heard it before, admitting that he had not expected, when Owen first brought news of a stranger discovered in the storm, that this particular wolf would come to occupy such significant space within his thoughts in the weeks that followed. Mira's breath caught at the admission, her own uncertain feelings suddenly finding unexpected echo in his words. She admitted in turn that she had not expected to find anything resembling belonging again after her exile, had braced herself instead for a life of perpetual wariness and isolation. Yet here, within this pack, within this particular alpha's careful protection, she had found something she had feared lost to her forever, not merely shelter, but genuine connection, genuine care extended without condition or expectation of repayment. The moment stretched between them, charged with unspoken possibility, neither quite ready to voice explicitly what both seemed to understand was building steadily beneath their careful, measured interactions. Cade reached out tentatively, his paw brushing gently against hers, a small gesture that nonetheless carried significant weight, given the careful distance both had maintained until this point. Mira did not pull away. Instead, she allowed herself, for the first time since her exile had upended everything familiar, to simply lean into the warmth of genuine connection being offered, trusting, cautiously but genuinely, that this particular shelter would prove more lasting than the temporary arrangement it had first been framed as weeks earlier. They did not speak further of what had passed between them as they made their way back toward the den that evening, though the quiet comfort of their shared silence carried a different quality than before, an unspoken understanding settling between them that neither felt compelled to rush toward more explicit acknowledgement. Some things, Mira understood instinctively, deserved to unfold at their own careful pace, particularly after so much upheaval had already reshaped her understanding of trust and belonging. Back within the den, the evening progressed with its usual warmth, though Mira noticed several knowing glances exchanged among the pack's members, suggesting that whatever had shifted between her and Cade during their patrol had not gone entirely unnoticed by wolves already primed to observe such developments. She did not mind the attention as much as she might have expected, finding instead a quiet contentment in the idea that this growing connection might eventually become something the entire pack could witness and support, rather than something requiring careful concealment. As she settled into sleep that night, surrounded by the familiar comfort of the den she had come to think of, cautiously but increasingly genuinely, as home, Mira allowed herself to consider, for the first time without immediate reflexive doubt, that perhaps her exile, however devastating it had seemed at the time, had ultimately delivered her towards something far more meaningful than the life she had lost. She did not yet know what the future held, whether the connection building between her and Cade would deepen into something lasting, whether her old pack's growing doubts about her exile might eventually lead to formal acknowledgement of the injustice done to her. But for tonight, surrounded by wolves who had chosen, again and again, to extend genuine care rather than convenient dismissal, she felt something she had not expected to feel again, so soon after losing everything familiar to her. She felt, unmistakably and gratefully, at peace. The peace Mira had allowed herself to embrace did not last entirely undisturbed. Nearly 2 months after her arrival within Frostback territory, a new wave of uncertainty arrived at the den's border, carried this time not by a diplomatic messenger like Daniel, but by a wolf whose presence immediately set every instinct within Mira on high alert. She recognized the visitor the moment his scent reached her, even before she saw him clearly emerging from the tree line at the territory's edge. It was Ethan, the wolf whose false accusations had led directly to her exile months earlier, standing at the border with an expression that carried far too much calculated calm for Mira's comfort. Her chest tightened immediately, old fear and anger rising in equal measure as she watched him request formal audience with Cade, apparently unaware, or unconcerned, that the wolf he had helped exile now stood within the very pack he had come to address. Cade's expression shifted the moment Mira's reaction made clear who this unexpected visitor was, his posture straightening with a protective alertness that Mira found herself grateful for, even amid the sudden resurgence of anxiety Ethan's arrival provoked. He did not immediately reveal Mira's presence, choosing instead to hear Ethan's stated purpose before deciding how best to proceed. Ethan explained, with practiced smoothness, that he represented a delegation from Mira's old pack, seeking to establish trade relations with Frostback territory regarding certain resources that had grown scarce within their own land during the harsh winter months. He made no mention of Mira specifically, apparently unaware that she had found shelter here, and Mira watched from a careful distance, hidden partially behind the den's rocky entrance, as Cade listened to this proposal with an expression that gave away nothing of what he already knew. Mira's thoughts raced as she observed the exchange, torn between the instinct to remain hidden, to avoid confronting the wolf whose lies had upended her entire life, and a growing, unexpected urge to finally face him directly, to reclaim some measure of the voice and agency his accusations had stripped from her months earlier. She thought of the vindication Daniel had mentioned, the growing doubts apparently spreading through her old pack regarding the fairness of her exile, and wondered whether this unexpected encounter might offer an opportunity she had not anticipated needing to consider. Elena, sensing Mira's internal struggle, moved quietly to her side, offering silent support without pressing her toward any particular decision. Mira appreciated the gesture, drawing some measure of steadiness from Elena's calm presence as she continued weighing whether to step forward or remain concealed until Ethan's business concluded and he departed Frostback territory entirely. It was Kade ultimately who made the decision for her, though not without first catching her eye and offering a questioning glance that silently asked whether she wished him to proceed differently. Mira held his gaze for a long moment before giving a small, decisive nod, some deep, long-buried part of her finally ready to confront the injustice that had shaped so much of her recent suffering. Kade addressed Ethan directly, his tone carrying a deliberate edge that immediately signaled a shift in the conversation's dynamics. He mentioned, without preamble, that Frostback territory had, in recent months, extended shelter to a wolf exiled from Ethan's own pack. A wolf whose circumstances surrounding that exile had apparently grown increasingly disputed, even among Ethan's own packmates. Ethan's composed expression faltered visibly at this revelation, though he recovered quickly, his voice carrying forced casualness, as he asked which wolf specifically Kade referred to. Kade did not answer immediately, instead gesturing toward the den's entrance, where Mira, drawing on reserves of courage she had not been certain she still possessed, stepped forward to stand fully visible before the wolf who had once destroyed her entire life with calculated lies. The recognition on Ethan's face was immediate and unmistakable, his composure cracking further as he registered not just Mira's presence, but the clear protection and support surrounding her within this unfamiliar territory. Mira watched him carefully, noting the flicker of calculation crossing his features, as he apparently worked to determine how best to navigate this unexpected complication to his diplomatic mission. She did not wait for him to formulate a response, speaking instead with a steadiness that surprised even herself, given how violently her heart was pounding beneath her calm exterior. She addressed him directly, asking plainly whether he still maintained the accusations that had led to her exile, whether he was prepared to repeat those same lies now, standing before wolves who had come to know her character firsthand over the preceding months. Ethan's eyes darted briefly toward Kade, clearly recalculating his approach, given the Alpha's evident support for Mira's position within this confrontation. He attempted, weakly, to deflect, suggesting that whatever had transpired within her old pack was a private matter, unrelated to the trade negotiations he had come to discuss. Mira refused to let the deflection stand unchallenged, pressing further, asking him directly whether he had in fact been the one responsible for the theft he had originally accused her of committing. The silence that followed her direct question stretched long and heavy, every wolf present within the den's clearing, watching Ethan's expression closely for any sign of the truth he had spent months carefully concealing. Finally, visibly cornered by the weight of witnesses and the impossibility of maintaining his composed deflection any longer, Ethan's careful mask began to crumble. He admitted, haltingly at first, and then with increasing, almost relieved clarity, that he had indeed been responsible for the missing stores that had led to Mira's exile, that his jealousy over her standing within the pack had driven him to shift blame onto her, rather than face consequences for his own actions. The confession, delivered before an audience of wolves who had extended Mira genuine care and protection throughout her recovery, carried a weight that Mira had not fully anticipated feeling when this confrontation finally arrived. Kade's expression hardened considerably as Ethan's confession concluded, his voice carrying unmistakable authority as he addressed the visiting wolf directly, making clear that Frostback territory would not proceed with any trade negotiations involving a delegation whose recent conduct had included such deliberate injustice toward one of its own members. He informed Ethan, in tones that left no room for further negotiation, that this confession would be relayed formally to Mira's old pack leadership, that the truth of her exile would finally be established beyond any remaining dispute. Ethan, visibly shaken by the complete unraveling of his carefully maintained deception, offered no further argument, departing Frostback territory with considerably less composure than he had arrived with, his diplomatic mission abandoned entirely in the wake of his exposed dishonesty. As his retreating form disappeared beyond the tree line, Mira remained rooted in place, processing the sudden, overwhelming reality of vindication finally achieved after months of carrying the weight of false accusation. Elena moved to her side immediately, offering quiet, steady support as the full weight of the moment settled over her. Around them, other pack members who had witnessed the confrontation offered murmured words of relief and satisfaction, genuine happiness for Mira, evident in expressions that had, months earlier, held nothing but wary suspicion toward her presence. Cade approached her once the immediate commotion settled, his expression carrying a mixture of protective pride and genuine relief that mirrored the complicated emotions Mira herself was still working to fully process. He told her quietly that she had shown remarkable courage confronting Ethan so directly that the truth she had waited so long to see acknowledged had finally, undeniably, been established before witnesses who would ensure it could never again be disputed or dismissed. Mira felt tears gathering, though whether from relief, lingering anger, or some complicated combination of both, she could not entirely determine. She had carried the weight of false accusation for so long that its sudden, decisive removal left her feeling almost unsteady, as though a burden she had grown accustomed to carrying had been abruptly and completely lifted from her shoulders. That evening, the pack gathered for what quickly became an impromptu celebration, wolves sharing stories and laughter with an ease that felt particularly meaningful given the vindication that had unfolded earlier that day. Mira found herself, for the first time since her exile, able to think of her old pack, of the injustice that had upended her life, without the accompanying weight of unresolved grievance that had shadowed her thoughts for months. Lily curled beside her throughout the evening's celebration, apparently sensing, in the intuitive way of young pups, that something significant had shifted for her favorite companion. Mira found comfort in the pup's simple, uncomplicated affection, a reminder that regardless of what had transpired with her old pack, the genuine belonging she had found here within Frostback territory remained steady and unwavering. As the celebration wound down and the pack gradually settled toward sleep, Cade found a quiet moment to speak with Mira privately, away from the lingering festivities. He told her, with quiet sincerity, that whatever came next, whatever formal acknowledgement her old pack might eventually offer regarding the injustice done to her, she should know that her place here, within Frostback territory, had never truly depended on such vindication in the first place. Mira thanked him softly, understanding the deeper meaning behind his words, the reassurance that her belonging here had been earned through her own character and actions, entirely independent of whatever truth had finally been established regarding her past. She allowed herself, in that quiet moment, to fully release the last remnants of doubt and anxiety that had lingered since her arrival, trusting completely, for the first time, in the genuine, unconditional acceptance this pack had extended toward her. As she finally settled into sleep that night, surrounded by the familiar comfort of the den and the quiet presence of wolves who had become, in every meaningful sense, her family, Mira felt a profound sense of closure settling over her, the painful chapter of her exile finally, truly concluding, making way for whatever new chapter awaited her within this place she had come, unmistakably now, to call home. News of Ethan's confession traveled faster than Mira had anticipated, carried across the border through the same channels that had originally brought Daniel's uncertain report of growing doubts within her old pack. Within days, a formal delegation arrived at Frostback territory, considerably more solemn and careful in their approach than Ethan's earlier attempt had been, seeking direct audience with Mira herself rather than pursuing any further diplomatic business with Cade. The delegation was led, to Mira's genuine surprise, by the very alpha who had presided over her exile months earlier, a wolf named Marcus, whose weathered expression carried visible signs of the difficult journey and even more difficult conversation he had apparently come to have. Mira watched his approach with a complicated mixture of lingering resentment and cautious curiosity, uncertain what this unexpected visit might mean for the carefully rebuilt life she had constructed within her new pack. Cade remained close beside her throughout the exchange, his presence offering silent reassurance that she would not need to face this confrontation, unlike her earlier one with Ethan, entirely alone. Marcus, for his part, seemed to understand the significance of Cade's protective proximity, addressing his opening words with careful respect toward both Mira and the pack that had extended her shelter. He began by formally acknowledging the grave injustice that had led to her exile, admitting openly that his failure to properly investigate Ethan's accusations before acting on them represented a serious lapse in his responsibilities as Alpha, one that had caused Mira significant, undeserved suffering. Mira listened to this acknowledgement with careful attention, searching his expression for any sign of insincerity, finding instead what appeared to be genuine, if belated, remorse. Marcus continued, explaining that Ethan's confession had prompted immediate consequences within their pack, that he had been stripped of his standing and formally exiled in turn, a measure of justice that offered Mira a strange, complicated satisfaction, given how thoroughly her own exile had upended her life months earlier. She found herself feeling less triumphant than she might have expected at this news, the passage of time, and the genuine belonging she had found within Frostback territory having softened, somewhat, the sharp edges of her earlier anger. The delegation's purpose, Marcus explained further, extended beyond simple acknowledgement of the wrong done to her. He had come, he said, to formally invite Mira back into her old pack, to restore her rank and standing, to offer, as best as circumstances now allowed, restoration of everything her false exile had stripped from her. The offer hung in the air between them, heavy with implications Mira had not fully anticipated needing to consider. She glanced instinctively toward Cade, whose expression remained carefully neutral, offering no indication of what he hoped her answer might be, clearly determined to let this decision rest entirely in her own hands, regardless of whatever feelings he might privately hold about the possibility of her departure. Mira took a long moment before responding, her thoughts turning over the complicated weight of Marcus's offer. She thought of the pack she had grown up within, of memories both cherished and painful that still lingered from her years there, before everything had unraveled so completely. She thought, too, of the months she had spent within Frostback territory, of the genuine belonging she had found here, the friendships forged through shared hardship and gradual trust, the deepening connection with Cade that had grown into something she was no longer willing to easily dismiss or abandon. She spoke finally, her voice steady despite the significance of what she was about to say, thanking Marcus for the acknowledgement of the injustice done to her, for the restored recognition of her innocence that would, at least, prevent such false accusations from being leveled against others in the future without proper investigation. But she made clear, with quiet but unmistakable certainty, that she would not be returning to her old pack, that the life she had rebuilt here within Frostback territory had become more genuinely her home than the pack she had been forced to leave months earlier ever fully had been, even before her exile. Marcus received this decision with visible surprise, clearly having anticipated that restoration of her former standing would be sufficient incentive to secure her return. He pressed gently, reminding her of the years of history and connection she was choosing to leave behind, but Mira remained resolute, explaining that the wolves who had shown her genuine unconditional care during her most vulnerable moments, wolves who had chosen to shelter and protect her without any prior obligation to do so, had earned a loyalty and belonging that her birth pack's belated acknowledgement could not simply override. She acknowledged, too, that the pack she had grown up within had shown, through their swift willingness to believe accusations against her without proper investigation, a fundamental fragility in their trust and loyalty that she was no longer willing to accept as the foundation of her belonging. Frostback territory, by contrast, had extended trust cautiously but genuinely, had required her to earn acceptance through demonstrated character rather than simple birthright, and that earned trust, she had come to understand, meant more to her than any restored rank her old pack might now offer. Marcus listened to her explanation with growing understanding, his expression shifting from initial surprise toward something closer to respectful acceptance. He acknowledged that her decision, while not what he had hoped to achieve through this visit, reflected clearly the strength of character that had apparently earned her such genuine standing within her new pack. He offered, before departing, a formal apology on behalf of his entire pack, along with assurance that Frostback Territory's trade relations with his own pack would proceed without any further complication from this matter. As the delegation prepared to depart, Marcus paused once more before Mira, offering a final, quieter acknowledgement that carried genuine emotion beneath its formal delivery. He told her that, despite everything that had transpired, He hoped she had found genuine happiness within her new circumstances, that the injustice she had suffered would not overshadow whatever future she chose to build going forward. Mira thanked him sincerely, some final measure of closure settling over her as she watched the delegation depart from Frostback territory, this time without any lingering uncertainty or unresolved tension clouding their departure. Cade remained close beside her throughout the final moments of the exchange, and once the delegation had fully disappeared beyond the tree line, he finally allowed a small, relieved smile to cross his features, an expression that told Mira clearly how much he had hoped, without pressuring her decision in any way, that she might choose to remain. She turned toward him, meeting his gaze with a warmth that had grown steadily throughout their months together, and told him simply that she had never seriously considered any other choice, that whatever history and connection her old pack represented, it could not compete with the genuine home she had found here, within this territory, among these wolves, beside him specifically. Cade's expression softened further at her words, and for a long moment, neither spoke, content simply to stand together in the quiet aftermath of a confrontation that had finally, definitively, closed the difficult chapter of Mira's exile. Around them, the rest of the pack had gathered at a respectful distance, having witnessed enough of the exchange to understand its significance. And as Mira and Cade finally turned to rejoin them, they were met with genuine, unrestrained celebration. Wolves who had come to consider Mira family, rejoicing openly at her decision to remain among them. That evening, the pack gathered once more for a celebration that carried even greater significance than their earlier gathering, following Ethan's confession. This was not merely vindication being celebrated now, but choice, Mira's own deliberate decision to claim Frostback territory as her genuine, permanent home, a decision that transformed her presence here, from temporary shelter, into something far more lasting and meaningful. Lily, predictably, remained close by her side throughout the festivities, though this time, her enthusiasm carried an additional layer of relieved joy, apparently having worried, in whatever way young pups process such complicated situations, that Mira might choose to leave despite the deepening bonds they had formed together. Mira reassured her repeatedly throughout the evening, making clear that she had no intention of going anywhere, that Frostback territory had become, unmistakably and permanently, her home. As the celebration wound down, and the pack gradually settled toward rest, Mira found herself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had brought her to this moment. From the depths of an exile that had once felt like the absolute end of everything meaningful in her life, through a storm that had nearly claimed her entirely, into the unexpected shelter and growing belonging she had found within a pack that owed her nothing yet had chosen, again and again, to extend genuine care and protection. Whatever challenges still lay ahead, she understood now, with complete and settled certainty, that she would face them from within a home that was truly, deservedly, hers. With the uncertainty of her past finally resolved, Mira found herself settling into Frostback territory, with a fullness of belonging she had not thought possible in the aftermath of her exile. The weeks that followed Marcus's visit passed with a comfortable, steady rhythm, each day adding another small layer to the foundation of home she had built within this pack, that had once been nothing more than a desperate refuge from a deadly storm. Her relationship with Cade continued to deepen during this time, the careful, tentative connection that had first bloomed during their border patrol together, growing steadily into something neither felt any need to hide or downplay any longer. The pack had long since noticed and quietly celebrated this growing bond, offering knowing smiles and gentle teasing that Mira found herself enjoying rather than deflecting, comfortable now, in a way she had not anticipated feeling again after everything her exile had taken from her. It was Elena who first suggested, during a quiet evening conversation, that Mira's transformation within the pack deserved more formal recognition than the gradual, informal acceptance she had experienced thus far. She mentioned that Frostback territory maintained certain traditions for welcoming outsiders who had proven themselves worthy of permanent standing within the pack, ceremonies that formally recognized a wolf's transition from guest to genuine member with full standing and belonging. Mira had not previously considered that such formal recognition might exist, having grown so accustomed to the quiet, accumulated acceptance she had experienced through daily interactions and shared experiences that the idea of a more official ceremony felt both exciting and somewhat overwhelming to contemplate. She asked Elena more about what such recognition would involve, and Elena explained, with evident enthusiasm, that the pack would gather formally, that Cade would speak on her behalf, and that she would be asked to affirm her commitment to the pack's well-being and unity in return. The prospect filled Mira with a complicated mixture of anticipation and lingering disbelief that her circumstances had shifted so dramatically from the desperate, exhausted collapse that had first brought her to this territory months earlier. She found herself, in quiet moments over the following days, reflecting frequently on just how far she had traveled, not merely in physical distance from her old pack, but in the deeper journey from isolation and false accusation, genuine belonging and earned trust. Cade, when Mira raised the topic with him directly, confirmed Elena's description with evident warmth, admitting that he had, in fact, already been considering proposing such formal recognition himself, having watched her integration into the pack deepen steadily over recent months, to the point where informal acceptance no longer seemed to fully capture the significance of her place within their community. He explained further, with a certain careful hesitation that Mira found endearing given his usual confident bearing as alpha, that he hoped the formal ceremony might also provide an appropriate occasion to address another matter he had been considering, one that extended beyond simple pack membership towards something more personal between the two of them specifically. Mira felt her heart quicken at the implication behind his words, though she said nothing immediately, allowing him space to continue at whatever pace felt comfortable for him. Cade continued, his voice carrying genuine vulnerability that Mira had come to recognize as a significant departure from his usual careful reserve, admitting that the months since her arrival had transformed not only the pack's collective well-being, but his own personal life, in ways he had not anticipated when he first made the decision to shelter a stranger discovered dying in the snow. He told her, plainly and without further hesitation, that he had come to care for her deeply, that the connection they had built together had grown into something he hoped might continue deepening, well beyond the formal recognition ceremony Elena had proposed. Mira felt tears gathering as she listened to his admission, the accumulated weight of everything she had survived and rebuilt over recent months, finally finding full, unguarded expression in this quiet, private moment between them. She told him, in turn, that she had come to feel the same growing connection, that the home and belonging she had found within Frostback territory had become inseparable, in her own understanding, from the genuine care and connection she felt toward him specifically. They stood together for a long moment, the significance of their mutual admission settling comfortably between them, before Cade finally suggested, with a hopeful smile that Mira found utterly disarming, that perhaps the formal ceremony might mark not only her full acceptance into the pack, but the beginning of something more permanent between the two of them as well, should she be amenable to such a proposal. Mira did not hesitate in her response, expressing genuine, unreserved enthusiasm for the possibility he had suggested, understanding clearly that whatever uncertain future still lay ahead, she wanted to face it alongside this steady, protective wolf who had chosen, from their very first meeting, to extend genuine care rather than convenient dismissal toward a stranger who had every reason to expect otherwise. Word of their growing understanding spread quickly through the pack in the days that followed, met with genuine celebration from wolves who had watched their connection develop gradually over recent months, and had, apparently, been quietly anticipating exactly this kind of resolution to their careful courtship. Lily, upon learning the news, expressed her characteristic enthusiasm without restraint, delighted at the prospect of Mira becoming even more permanently established within the pack she had grown to love as her own family. The days leading up to the formal ceremony passed with a particular kind of anticipatory warmth, the entire pack contributing in various ways to prepare for what had become, in the collective understanding of Frostback territory, a celebration not merely of Mira's formal acceptance, but of the deepening bond between her and their alpha as well. Grace prepared special herbs and decorations for the occasion, while Owen and Victor, whose relationship with Mira had transformed so completely from initial suspicion to genuine friendship, took particular pride in helping organize the practical arrangements for the gathering. As the appointed evening finally arrived, Mira found herself standing at the edge of the clearing where the ceremony would take place, watching the pack gather with a mixture of nervous anticipation and profound gratitude that threatened, at times, to overwhelm her composure entirely. She thought back, in these quiet final moments before the ceremony began, to the desperate, exhausted collapse that had first brought her to this territory, to the storm that had nearly claimed her life entirely, and marveled at how completely her circumstances had transformed in the months since. Cade approached her, as the gathering settled into readiness, offering a warm, reassuring smile that helped steady her nerves considerably. He took his place before the assembled pack, and Mira watched with growing emotion as he began to speak, his words carrying the same quiet authority and genuine warmth that had first drawn her toward trusting him during those uncertain early weeks of her recovery. He spoke of finding her in the storm, of the pack's initial caution and gradual acceptance, of the courage and character she had demonstrated repeatedly throughout her months among them, from her rescue of Victor during the treacherous hunt to her steady confrontation with Ethan's false accusations. He spoke, too, of the personal connection that had grown between them, making clear before the entire assembled pack his intention to formally welcome Mira, not merely as a full member of Frostback territory, but as his chosen partner going forward. The assembled wolves responded with genuine, enthusiastic celebration, howls rising into the cold evening air in a chorus that Mira felt resonating deep within her chest, a sound that represented, unmistakably, complete and unconditional acceptance from a community that had, months earlier, been nothing more than cautious strangers, uncertain whether to trust the exhausted, injured wolf discovered collapsed within their territory. Mira stepped forward when Cade gestured for her to join him, and standing before the pack that had become, so thoroughly and genuinely, her family, she affirmed her own commitment to their shared well-being and unity, her voice steady, despite the profound emotion coursing through her, as she spoke the formal words that would establish her permanent, unquestioned place within Frostback territory. As the ceremony concluded, and the celebration that followed stretched joyfully into the night, wolves gathering around the fire in shared laughter and warmth, Mira allowed herself, fully and without reservation, to embrace the profound sense of belonging that had once seemed impossibly lost to her following her exile. She had traveled an extraordinary distance, not merely across unfamiliar territory during that desperate blizzard months earlier, but through the far more difficult journey from betrayal and isolation toward genuine trust and lasting connection. Lily curled contentedly beside her as the evening celebration finally began winding toward rest, and Mira found herself surrounded, in this quiet, comfortable moment, by everything she had once feared, permanently lost to her: genuine family, genuine belonging, and genuine love, each element woven together into a life she had rebuilt from the depths of an exile that had once felt like the absolute end of everything meaningful, transformed instead into the unexpected beginning of everything she had truly needed all along. Winter returned to Frostback territory nearly a full year after the storm that had first brought Mira, exhausted and half-frozen, into the lives of wolves who had every reason to turn her away, and instead chose to offer shelter. The season arrived gradually this time, the temperature dropping steadily over several weeks, rather than descending suddenly in the violent, deadly manner of the blizzard that had first tested her strength and nearly claimed her life entirely. Much had changed within Frostback territory during the intervening months since her formal acceptance into the pack. Mira's role within the community had grown steadily, her demonstrated skill in navigating difficult terrain, and her thoughtful, steady presence during pack discussions, earning her genuine standing among the pack's most trusted members. She worked closely alongside Elena, now on matters of territory management, her perspective valued and sought after in ways that would have seemed unimaginable during those first uncertain days of her recovery. Her relationship with Cade had similarly deepened and strengthened throughout the passing months, their partnership evident in the easy, comfortable rhythm they had established both in leading the pack together and in the quieter, more personal moments they shared away from the demands of daily pack life. The bond between them had become, in the collective understanding of Frostback territory, a source of stability and strength that the entire pack had come to rely upon. As the first significant snowfall of this new winter season began accumulating outside the den, memories of that original desperate storm inevitably resurfaced within Mira's thoughts, though now viewed through the transformed perspective of everything she had gained, rather than the raw fear and uncertainty that had characterized her first experience of Frostback Territory's harsh winter conditions. She found herself, on this particular evening, standing near the den's entrance, watching the snow fall steadily across the familiar landscape she had come to think of, unequivocally, as home. Cade joined her at the entrance, his presence warm and familiar beside her as they watched the winter's first substantial snowfall blanket the territory in fresh white powder. He mentioned, with a knowing smile, that the timing of this snowfall carried particular significance, arriving almost exactly 1 year after the storm that had first brought her stumbling, exhausted and desperate, into their lives. Mira acknowledged the significance with a quiet smile of her own, reflecting on how completely different this winter felt, compared to the terror and uncertainty of the previous year's blizzard. Where she had once faced the storm entirely alone, without shelter, without pack, without any certainty of surviving the night, she now stood surrounded by everything she had once feared, permanently lost to her, secure in the knowledge that whatever winter brought, she would face it alongside wolves who had proven, repeatedly and unconditionally, their genuine care and commitment toward her well-being. As the evening deepened and the snowfall continued steadily outside, the rest of the pack gradually gathered within the den's warm interior, settling into their familiar evening routines with the comfortable ease of a community that had grown, over the preceding year, into something far more cohesive and unified than the cautious, occasionally divided group that had first debated whether to shelter a stranger discovered collapsed at their territory's border. Lily, no longer quite so small as she had been during Mira's first weeks within the pack, curled contentedly nearby as the evening progressed, her earlier fascination with the mysterious stranger having long since matured into genuine, steady affection for someone she now considered an integral part of her own family structure within the pack. Victor and Owen, whose relationships with Mira had transformed so completely from initial wariness and cautious defense respectively into genuine, easy friendship, engaged in comfortable conversation nearby, occasionally drawing Mira into their discussion with the natural ease of wolves who had long since stopped viewing her as anything other than a fully belonging member of their community. Grace moved through the den, checking on various pack members with her characteristic quiet attentiveness, pausing briefly to exchange warm words with Mira, their relationship having grown, over the preceding year, into something resembling genuine friendship built upon the careful, patient care Grace had first extended during Mira's difficult recovery from the storm's near-fatal effects. As the night deepened further, and the temperature outside continued dropping steadily with the persistent snowfall, the pack gradually settled toward their usual sleeping arrangements, wolves curling together for warmth and comfort, in the manner that had become customary during the coldest nights of winter. Mira found herself settling into her familiar place beside Cade, their bond evident in the natural, comfortable way they arranged themselves together amid the gathering warmth of the pack's collective presence. But this particular night carried something additional, something Mira had not quite anticipated, even after a full year of growing belonging within Frostback Territory. As the pack settled fully into rest, one by one the wolves who had become, so completely and genuinely, her family began arranging themselves not merely nearby, but specifically around her, as though some unspoken collective instinct had determined that this particular anniversary deserved particular acknowledgement through the simple, powerful language of physical protection and belonging. Elena settled close on one side, her steady presence a reminder of the quiet wisdom and support she had offered throughout Mira's entire journey within the pack. Owen positioned himself nearby as well, the scout whose fateful discovery in the snow had first set this entire remarkable journey into motion. Victor, whose transformation from skeptic to genuine friend had marked one of the most significant shifts in Mira's acceptance within the pack, settled protectively close as well, his presence a testament to how thoroughly earned trust could overcome even the most stubborn initial doubt. Grace curled nearby with her characteristic gentle attentiveness, while Lily, predictably and adorably, wedged herself as close to Mira as physically possible, apparently determined not to be left out of whatever collective gesture the rest of the pack seemed to be quietly orchestrating. Additional pack members Mira had grown close to throughout the preceding months arranged themselves similarly, until she found herself, quite unexpectedly, surrounded on all sides by wolves who had chosen, deliberately and collectively, to form a protective circle around her as the winter's snow continued falling steadily outside. Cade remained closest of all, his presence anchoring the protective formation that had gathered around her, and as Mira took in the full scope of what was happening, tears gathered unexpectedly in her eyes, overwhelmed by the profound symbolism of this particular arrangement, given everything that had brought her to this exact moment, exactly 1 year removed from the desperate, solitary collapse that had first led her into frostback territory. She understood, with complete and settled clarity, the significance of what surrounded her now. Where she had once faced the deadly cold entirely alone, stripped of pack, stripped of protection, stripped of any certainty that another living creature cared whether she survived the night, she now found herself embraced entirely by wolves who had chosen, again and again throughout the preceding year, to extend genuine, unconditional care toward her. Wolves who now, on this particular anniversary, seemed to be marking that transformation through the simplest, most powerful gesture available to them: physical closeness, offered freely and completely. Mira allowed herself, in this profound, overwhelming moment, to fully absorb the reality of how completely her circumstances had transformed since that desperate night 1 year earlier. She had arrived at frostback territory with absolutely nothing, exiled, injured, and utterly alone, facing what had seemed, in her most desperate moments during that original storm, like certain death in unfamiliar, unwelcoming territory. She now found herself instead surrounded by an entire pack of wolves who had become, through countless small moments of demonstrated care and earned trust, her genuine, unconditional family. As sleep gradually began claiming the gathered pack, warmth accumulating steadily from the collective presence surrounding her, Mira felt Cade's steady breathing beside her, felt Lily's small form curled trustingly against her other side, felt the protective presence of wolves who had once been strangers, now arranged carefully around her like a living, breathing shield against whatever cold or hardship the world might yet bring. She closed her eyes finally, allowing herself to drift toward sleep, surrounded by this remarkable, unexpected family, understanding with complete certainty that whatever challenges the future might hold, she would never again face them entirely alone. The storm that had once threatened to end her life had instead delivered her towards something far more valuable than mere survival: a genuine home, genuine belonging, and a family bound together not by circumstance of birth, but by the far stronger, far more meaningful bond of choice, care, and earned, unconditional trust. Outside, the snow continued falling steadily throughout the night, blanketing frostback territory in fresh winter white, while inside the den, 10 wolves slept peacefully together, arranged in a protective circle around the exiled Omega, who had, through her own quiet strength and their collective, generous choice to extend genuine care, transformed from a desperate stranger, discovered dying in a blizzard, into the cherished, permanent heart of their pack. By morning, when the first pale light of dawn finally broke across the snow-covered landscape, that same protective circle remained unbroken, a living testament to how thoroughly belonging, once genuinely offered and genuinely earned, could transform even the most desperate exile into the truest kind of home.